Good morning. My name's Philip Hayes. I'm with the Arnold Group, and I have been very involved in the UI reform space in Kansas, I'd say for more than the last dozen years or so. Since 2013, I've served on the Kansas Employment Security Board of Review as well. And that process and relationships that I've built with KDOL throughout the years has certainly been important and beneficial or impactful, I guess, as we navigated some of the pandemic waters as we've just completed throughout 2020 and the better part of this year already. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just jump in. Today, what I intend to hit on is the impact on the Kansas Unemployment Trust Fund, how that impacts employers, but ultimately claimants or employees as well, the impact specifically on employers and those claimants, and some of the challenges that it's presented and kind of the path as we move forward um, to help position our employer, but also help assist our employees or claimants throughout the process. We're going to look at the multi-factor authentication or the identity verification pieces. We'll look at some fraud mitigation strategies specific for employees as well as employers, and then we'll close throughout the comments, the closing slides with questions and comments. And really just to kind of set the stage, one of the comments that came in ahead of time was just the level of frustration that employers have had throughout this process. In fact, the individual has shared one of the main issues that we had is the time frame in responding to the claims because it's so cumbersome and burdensome. But we have a 10-day postmark, 10-day window to get our appeals and responses in the mail. But when you couple that with the business shutdowns, the mail delays, the weekends, etc., sometimes that window shrank way down and presented additional challenges. The real thing that kind of led off for the fraud or the opening the fraud doors for Kansas as well as other states was looking at the impact of COVID and the business shutdowns that state agencies wanted to get benefits out to those that needed them as quickly as possible. That sounds great on the front end, but then if we don't have any integrity measures or we didn't take those measures seriously, we ended up with the problem that we're in now, or the boat that we're in. I will tell you that from March 2020 through January of 2021, to the end of January, Kansas SHRM and the Kansas business community was beating on the drums and sounding the alarm, saying that fraud is coming. There was a lot of my colleagues had a lot of people that touched base with me throughout the pandemic saying we're getting hammered with fraudulent or suspicious claims, potentially fraudulent claims. So I don't know that we know the true impact or really the true ramifications of what it looks like. We may not know that for some time, but we'll get into that here in just a bit and kind of the path that we're going to take to try to really uncover the true enormity of the impact. So back in October, early October, KDOL had actually issued a memo saying that they were seeing a record spike in identity theft related unemployment fraud in Kansas and nationally. It was around this time frame that early October is kind of when I started sensing the bigger wave of UI fraud cases that were presenting. I was getting contacted pretty much daily from colleagues around the state. We continued to echo our voices and ran it up the flagpole to KDOL saying there's more fraud coming. There's been a high suspicion throughout the summer months of 2020, but as we entered the fall, that picture, what we've seen come across our desks certainly seemed to have magnified it. So you fast forward 3 months, so December 7th of 2020, KDOL had announced that they had reported more than 157,000 total fraudulent claims or attempts. And so some of the language is a little bit marked and it's intentional. So trying to find really kind of what that middle ground is or what the truth is. And some of this has been frustrating as we've navigated this, but then throughout the legislative session to try to get our hands around this. If you break that 157,000 down, and they had also indicated that they were stopping about 2,300 daily fraudulent claims or attempts. So you take that 157 divided by the 2,300, we're looking at about 70 days, give or take, and that backtracks to late September. And why some of these numbers are important to me is just I really felt like we didn't have a grasp on it, but once some of the statements that started coming out, trying to piece the puzzle together, we were actually seeing early indications of suspicious claims and fraudulent cases as early as March. KDOL, or Kansas SHRM, and the Kansas business community is on record to the tune of about 4 dozen times from March through the end of the year saying we've got problems. But you can see that the top graph here is the line of initial unemployment claims nationally. So you can see at the bottom segment here, Kansas pretty much mirrored the national trend line. Where we started to differ a little bit, though, was once we got into the fall months, we were still on this roller coaster of the ups and downs, and we were seeing various spikes from week to week. And so I just kind of earmarked the dates from the known data points that KDOL had published. We thought fraud was bad, or at least saying that we had seen such a heavy spike in October through December. But then when you really fast forward the next few weeks, the holiday surprise that waited around the corner for us after Christmas and the New Year's surprise, January was just astronomical. It really actually minimized our initial incline at the onset of the pandemic. So as far as initial claims. So this was certainly pretty telling. As we got into the legislative session, myself and Jeff Oswald with Unemployment Insurance Services went to Topeka and tried to tell the story and the impact and kind of what we were seeing. And what we ended up summarizing was actually week ending 116, but then 123 was actually even far worse. If you look at the second column under population, Kansas has 2.9 million people, total population in the US, 328 million. We had less than 1% of the US population, yet we were accounting in the far right column for nearly 10% of all the new unemployment claims in that single week for all the United States. And so the prior week certainly looked just as telling, but it was certainly, we were on somebody's radar. We were what I would say is an easy mark. We didn't have a lot of measures in place, the integrity measures to protect the integrity of the UI system. What Kansas and other states have found is the traditional programs, they've been around for years, since the 1930s, and they've grown and they've put certain security measures in place, but we were still probably in an exposed position. But really what magnified this was the PUA program, or the federal unemployment enhanced benefit programs. So essentially every state labor agency had to build a brand new system to pass out or award these claimant dollars as they went. So it didn't have the robust and normal security measures for all these new startup platforms to administer these benefits. So I will say that on January 26th is when Jeff and myself went up to Topeka, testified in front of the Kansas Senate Commerce Committee that morning, and then the afternoon to the Kansas House Economic and Labor Committee. And it was at that time that I had espoused that I felt like the amount of unemployment fraud in Kansas was about $300 to $600 million. It's a pretty wide range, but depending on how you maybe calculate or pursue those, you can get to 300 million pretty easily. The 600, although that seemed to be a high number, it really isn't too far out of whack with what has been reported from a legislative post-audit since then. So just to kind of give you some numbers, and I know these charts are relatively small, but if you look at line 4, the projected date of the U.S. Or the Kansas Trust Fund bankruptcy, we were looking at February or March of 2021 that our fund was going to be bankrupt. This was as of week ending 123. So we had about 8 weeks left of benefits in the coffers before we were going to be in a borrowing position. You'll see on line 6 with the red box, what was initially reported to the U.S. Department of Labor for initial claims in Kansas was 82,944. Once a week passed and we were talking about the amount of potential fraud in Kansas, KDOL had revised their numbers downward to 25,489, and that's what's on the KDOL reporting. However, it doesn't necessarily jive with the US DOL reporting for that week. But you can see just the sheer escalation on line 6 there, the number of claims going from 34,000 to 30,000, 45,000, and being north of 70,000 for several weeks. The amount of benefits that were paid out, again, in that same 6-week period, we went from paying, and these are just traditional Kansas SUTA benefits, not the federal program benefits. We went from 30 million to 34 million to 41 to 44 million, back down to 32 million for week ending 123. If you look at just the far right highlighted yellow columns there, the last 4 weeks, so the month of January, we paid out 152 million in traditional Kansas employer paid unemployment benefits. So on a weekly average, about 38 million is what we were pushing out the door through that extremely high climb that we've seen in January. So the testimony that we had, I presented a couple of different fraud estimates and ways on how we got there. 371 million is kind of what we were initially looking at as kind of a landing point between the averages. What was interesting, I think that was a Wednesday when we had testified, Governor Kelly had indicated she was going to shut down the Kansas unemployment system and implement some solutions to help fight the fraud. And what we ended up with is implementing a LexisNexis overlay onto our existing system. It was a multi-factor authentication, meaning that I think multi-factor authentication is pretty prominent and common in a lot of organizations now. Most of us are used to it, but we were pretty exposed before the last weekend in January. What was interesting is once that went into effect, so you let the dust settle from week ending 130 and 2/6, and look at week endings 213 through 3/6, the next 4 weeks, our benefits averaged 6.7 million to 9.9 million, and a 4-week average was 6.5 million, well below the 38.2 million that we were previously paying on a weekly average basis prior to the identity verification solution. So, and you'll see the trust fund bankruptcy projection date essentially fast forwarded 9 months, and we were not going to be in a borrowing position. We were going to have first quarter and second quarter contributions hit the trust fund. And why that's important is if we're in a borrowing position, and that if that's not paid back within 2 Januaries, then essentially the Fed start reducing the FUTA credit reduction, and every employer in Kansas would have had an increased FUTA increase as well as increased SUTA rates. So we were certainly to see that solution be put in place. I will tell you, we had a call back in June, I think it was mid-year of 2020, with KDOL asking, can we not pursue an identity verification solution? And so we were calling for that resolution about 8 months prior before it actually went into place. So it's nice that we have it, but again, we're probably about 8 months too late, considering that we paid out north of $1 billion out of our trust fund, and there's a fair amount of that is going to turn out to be fraud. So when you look at kind of the fraud comparison, the first 4 weeks, or the last 4 weeks leading up to the MFA solution, and then the 4 weeks from February 13th through March 6th, we've seen almost an 83% decrease in the average weekly benefit amount coming out of the Kansas Unemployment Trust Fund. So it was a huge deal. And again, probably about 8 months too late to really minimize the pain point. But I think Kansas was marked as an easy state with limited integrity measures. And it turned out that we were definitely vulnerable and had time to act and react, but we waited far too long. We were one of the later states to actually take any sort of measures to counter that. So just another way to kind of look at the fraud estimates. Kansas, I think the last reporting period that USDOL reports for the benefits accuracy measurement for every state, Kansas was at 14.21%. So a little over 14% of all of our claims that get paid out were typically either improper payments or fraudulent in some nature. And this was before the pandemic hit. So we're anxious to see what our number actually turns out to be in the next reporting period, and how Kansas stacks up, not only through COVID, but more importantly, once we put these security measures in place. But you can see the line in the sand on the far right column here where the MFA solution was implemented. Our claims essentially diminished. You look at week ending 3/6, and they're relatively close to what we were right before the weeks of the pandemic hitting. I will tell you, claim counts as of last week, we're actually right on pace with where we were right before the pandemic hit. So number of claims, initial as well as continued claims, are significantly down now. But we'll see what the fraud estimates come out to be, or not even the estimates, but the actual counts. KDOL had indicated they attest to 290 million that they feel is fraudulent throughout the pandemic. Some of that is the Kansas Employer Trust Fund, as well as some of the federal benefits. The legislative post-audit that reported in February, I believe it was, indicated that that number is actually closer to double, right at 600 million. And there's some estimates that put us far over that 600 million, where we could be north of $500 million just with the Kansas UI Trust Fund alone, on top of the federal enhanced dollars as well. So if we look at, as of February 23rd, KDOL went on record and indicated that they had turned over 50,000 fake unemployment claims to the federal investigators. That number is striking. It's certainly alarming to a lot of us. What's more alarming is these 50,000 fake claims do not account for anything reported or attempted to be filing a claim in January of 21. January of 21 is really where our biggest exposure point was out of the entire pandemic. So after the MFA solution was actually put in place, the number of bots and fraudulent login attempts that has been stopped since February 3rd of 21. You can see, and these are all cumulative numbers, but I just wanted to show you that the pace has not really diminished. Within the first week, there was north of 1 million fraudulent or bot login attempts. By March 8th, which is about 5 weeks into it, we had north of 6 million stopped fraudulent attempts. As of last week, 2 weeks ago, we're at 7.8 million that the KDOL website has stopped with the multi-factor authentication. And as good as that sounds, we're certainly keeping out the bad actors, but one of the ramifications of this process is we've got legitimate claimants that are still tied up in the system and are having frustrations as they move forward. So I will go to the next slide here. The image in the upper right is basically, I felt like we built a dam. We put a dam to close the floodgates in place, and these snapshots were part of a report presented by Wallet Hub toward the end of April of this year. And you'll see Kansas is the only state that is listed in the most improved position out of all 4 of these areas. So the smallest increase from the previous or the last week in 2019. So looking long-term, the smallest increase for the previous week versus the start of 2020. So Kansas is in a great position, and Kansas, I think, is receiving a lot of headlines and accolades saying how much our economy has actually improved since the start of the pandemic. But I almost feel like it's an artificial measurement, because we had so much fraud that we've seen a huge decrease from 1 week to the next. We really closed the doors for the fraudsters, and I think that's indicating that. So although I don't want to take away our position, we'll take it. So definitely moving in the right direction, and a lot of our indicators today show that as well. So there was also at the end of April, the Federal Trade Commission published a report saying that Kansas was the #1 state in the year 2020 as it related to identity theft in the nation. So in 2019, we had just under 2,300 identity theft reports across Kansas. In 2020, we had 43,211. So we had an 1,800% increase from one year to the next. That's largely the impact of coronavirus and the loose measures that we had in place with the Kansas unemployment system. visually you can see how we stack up in the states. But what's more alarming for me in the lower right, in 2020, even though we had 43,210 cases throughout all of 2020, in first quarter alone of 2021, we had just a hair over 36,000 identity theft reports in first quarter alone. And I would attribute probably the lion's share of those to happen specifically in the month of January, when we've seen such an escalation before we put the identity verification solution in place. So just to kind of really paint the picture a little more, Kansas had 4 of the top 5 metro areas in the U.S. So Lawrence had, out of every 100,000 persons in a community, Lawrence had 1,700, Wichita had 1,400, Manhattan 1,200. Tuscaloosa, Alabama snuck in the 4th spot, but then Topeka was number 1 with, or actually Tuscaloosa was 5th, so Topeka a little over 1,900. So we were definitely kind of sitting ducks, and I think a lot of the fraudsters, a lot of them were overseas actors, that they kind of went through the order of states and throughout 2020 kind of poked holes where they could and seen who was most vulnerable. And I think they kind of set Kansas up toward the end because all the reports that they were getting, we were not as secure. We were kind of an easy mark. And so the numbers do tell a pretty striking story here. So where we sit as of June 7th, we've actually had, since the MFA went into play, we have 170,000 Kansans or claimants that have authenticated their account. We have 5,700 claimants that are awaiting additional user action. Could be they need to submit additional documentation. There's a number of things. There's 105,000 that have been proofed or approved. 60,000 have failed their ID proofing phase. There's 59 that have experienced some sort of error. And then again, the 7.8 million fraudulent or bot login attempts that have been blocked. And then so far today, KDOL has decommissioned or deprovisioned a little over 21,000 profiles that they have determined have been fraudulent. So we'll see how these numbers shape up as more time passes throughout this year and probably even into the new year, because I really don't think the scope of our exposure is going to be known until we get our benefit charge statements at the end of the year for contributing employers, and then we go through the next phase of appeals and really let the dust settle from that based on the employer engagement that KDOL is going to get to settle some of this. So most recent 4 weeks, 6/5 is the last week that KDOL has reported, but you can see we dropped down to 6.5 million, I think it was, after the MFA. Our weekly average now is trending a little over 4.7 million on a weekly basis out of the Kansas Trust Fund. Our solvency target date right now is February of 23. So we're definitely in much better shape. The good news there is we've got additional quarterly contributions that will still hit. But the big news is we've really just stemmed the tide as far as the flood of fraudulent dollars walking out of the state and ultimately walking out of our country. So next, we'll kind of dive into some of the guidance piece. And I pieced these next few slides together just based on webinars that I've sat in, engagement with KDOL, and other research as I've helped individuals throughout their particular situation throughout the pandemic. So the FBI actually, these number one, they had pushed out some early warning notifications saying that be on the lookout for these types of suspicious activities. I don't know that we did a great job as a state in pushing out early detection, early notification, but it was just such an onslaught from the beginning, and just KDOL was understaffed because their staffing level is based on claimant levels. And so we went from our historic lowest levels ever in the state of Kansas to seemingly our highest watermark in April of 2020. And so there's no way from a staffing standpoint that we were prepared to handle this. But hindsight's always 2020. There's certainly things that I think we can improve and do better. next time, and we're going to talk some about kind of the direction that we move forward as a state. We'll get into more of that tomorrow, but definitely some tough lessons learned for Kansas as well as other states throughout the pandemic as it relates to unemployment. But they put out a number of what I consider common sense. I typically live with my guard up, and I'm suspicious of whether it's spam emails, phishing emails, texting that's coming through. Typically, I won't respond to those. If I think it's legitimate and I want to pursue it, I'll typically jump on a Google search and try to backtrack into that same data, find a contact number that I can call rather than responding to a link. But again, common sense, never giving out personal information over email or text. I think a lot of this is what we as HR professionals, from a policy standpoint within our employers, try to push out and make sure that people aren't doing this. Don't wire money, always ignore the following requests. If somebody, and this was a big one, there's a lot of people impersonating KDOL reps saying we can help you. I just need some information from you, or it's going to cost you a little bit of money if you want to fast track your claim. And so if it sounds too good to be true, more often than not it is. And the tough thing is I don't think there was any shortcuts at all as it related to the unemployment concerns and lines and pain points that everybody was having. So, there's oftentimes telltale signs in phishing emails, misspelled words, unusual addresses, statements demanding action right away, asking for bank information. So I'm just pretty distrusting. I mean, again, common sense, don't give out your personal information on websites, social media, etc. And third parties cannot apply for your benefits. There's third-party administrators for employers, but typically nobody's filing the claim on your behalf. There's an attestation acknowledgement that the information you submit is true and accurate. And so as far as benefits fraud, what I would say is first and foremost, whether you're an identity theft victim or not, I would protect your social security number and other personal information. And I would just live life moving forward and expect that your personal information is out there. I think it was last Monday, it was published that a hacking memo was published that had 8.4 billion password combinations on it. And that's been released. It was called RockU21. So if you have easily identifiable passwords, the likelihood of having your data exposed is probably greater today than it was before last Monday. So, but if you do feel like you're a victim of benefits fraud, or if you have an employee that may be a fraud victim, number one, just verify the fraud. We want to report it. One thing that Kansas does that I think is far greater than most other states is by reporting it through KDOL. They actually have a law enforcement administration function within the department, so they can actually issue police case numbers when you report it using the report fraud portal. That saves you an extra step from having to report it with a local law enforcement agency to put blocks on your credit accounts, etc. So, but definitely report it to KDOL as well as your employer. You certainly want to assess the damage. And the tough thing is we don't know what the extent of this is going to be. I think unemployment fraud is kind of phase one. There was some early indications that tax consequences, there's tax fraud year after year after year, but we'll see if additional reporting follows that there was an escalation with that as well. We want to remediate that damage as quickly as we can, and we're going to talk more about that as we get into subsequent slides. And ultimately just taking precautions. So be alert to any suspicious emails, very similar to what we just kind of covered, but warning signs, the top three: offers from people or organizations that you don't recognize, promising early or faster UI benefits. Nobody has the ability to do that. They're just fishing for data. Number two, solicitation from people you don't know, offering money in exchange for personal information. Maybe not your personal information, but others. Letters, emails, texts indicating new accounts or UI benefits have been initiated in your name. And I think this is pretty common that we had seen throughout the pandemic. Had a lot of people reach out to me and said, "Hey, I got this unemployment claim notice. It's to somebody else. It's my address, but it's not to me." And KDOL says you can return them to them. KDOL also says that you can report fraud cases if you receive a notice. So I think that's probably one of the more vigilant things that anybody can do is report it, even if it's not your name. If it's tied to your address, chances are somebody else may have got your name and social at a different address. So I've encouraged everybody to report any notices. And if they don't want to report it, send it back to KDOL as not at this address, etc. But we want them to be able to get a firm grip on the overall scope of this. Reporting UI fraud guidance from KDOL, really fraudulent claims. It's one thing to be have your data exposed and out there, but when you're an actual fraud victim or an identity theft victim is when somebody creates a claim using yours or your employee's personal information, social security number, date of birth, etc. And again, that exposure doesn't just start and stop with the unemployment. If that data is out there, there's likely additional financial harm that could result. So remaining vigilant, immediately report any suspicious activity related to an unemployment claim. So as an employer, I worked with a lot of colleagues that they received notices, but it wasn't their employee. And they said, what do we do? And so we opened the fraud portal and report it. And again, KDOL opened that portal in October of last year. And I think there's been a fair amount of reporting through it, but I don't think it's captured the full scope of those fraudulent claims. So if you receive a letter or a debit card in the mail for UI benefits that you didn't file for, certainly report it. If you suspect somebody has fraudulently filed for a benefit in your name, report it. If you're suspicious, I would report it. Any such cases can be reported at the reportfraud.ks.gov site. That is the official KDOL fraud reporting site. It generates an automatic police case number for an employee. The employee or you as the employer can report a fraudulent claim. After you submit that claim or the fraud report, then KDOL's fraud investigation unit is going to take appropriate action. They will freeze that account. If any payments were made, they're going to try to avoid the 1099 tax consequence. And we've kind of passed that bridge or that point of time at this point. But I fully suspect that somebody's social could have been tied to a fraudulent account and went to a different address. So we'll see if the IRS disagrees with what's reported. KDOL does have a self-help, self-service portal that you can go in and request a corrected 1099 now for your employees. And I'll present that link here in just a minute. But the bigger thing from an employer standpoint, as much as the pain points for the claimant, is there's a financial implication also for employers. So if you report something that's tied to your employer account, those charges should not be assessed to your employer. And we're going to talk about additional steps that you can get into later this year to really help protect your employer's account. So if you do receive a UI notice for somebody else concerning a claim that you did not make, the best thing you can do is report it. I can't stress that enough. So beginning mid-December, KDOL announced that it was working with law enforcement. They were working with the Secret Service, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Labor, and the U.S. Attorney General's office. Most recent reports that I've seen come out over the last week and a half is at the beginning of the onset of the pandemic, they were saying they expected $6 to $28 billion of fraud dollars to disappear from the UI streams across the U.S. And now those numbers that I'm seeing are 400 billion. And so it's definitely magnified. The federal enriched benefits were just far too rich of a target for bad actors to get involved, and that's what we've seen happen. So a couple of sites, the legitimate Kansas official, the Kansas Department of Labor websites, their main website. I always just start with Googling KDOL, make sure I land on the dol.ks.gov site, the unemployment benefit site, the PUA benefit site. And the reason I give these is if you have a claimant or a past employee, there was a couple of different spoofing websites that were presented as KDOL's benefit website, and they were not legitimate. So bad actors were trying to siphon additional personal information to actually turn around and go to the appropriate or the legitimate portal and wreak havoc and chaos. So the reportfraud.ks site, if you can't remember that one, fraudreport.ks.gov works as well. They've got both sites. They both point to the same place. One thing that I will say is their website is extremely browser picky. They recommend only using Chrome, Firefox, and Edge. And so if you have a user that's using Safari or Internet Explorer, check the browser first and foremost. Once you typically get into one of these three browsers, claimants are typically able to move forward with that fraud reporting. Fraud hotline, there's an 800 number. Probably wouldn't be my first solution or first attempt. I'd try to go through the website if at all possible. And then KDOL actually just stood up the UI benefit self-service portal. And there's a couple of good avenues if somebody is trying to contest their identity and wants to upload their identity documents in a secure fashion. This is the site that will allow you to do it. This is also the site that employers can go and report job refusals. And so it's kind of once you get into the main site, you can walk through the claimant door, you can walk through the employer door, and there's a number of different services and resources that you can access. If you want to go beyond the state level, the U.S. Department of Labor's website, they have a report UI fraud as well. They've got some additional resources reporting identity theft. Within these bottom two URLs, there's additional resources. I want to say it's a 12-page guide on very detailed steps that you can issue to employees, or at least give them these links to say, here's some additional steps. I summarize those I say the top 10, top 9 here. If you think your identity has been stolen, or you have a fraudulent claim against you, number one, file it. So there's no harm in filing it. It puts your name and your social on record. Essentially, it's going to put a fraud freeze on your social, and you will get a police case number. The only problem with this is if an employee has reported a fraud case against them and then they're subsequently laid off or eligible for a legitimate claim, they're going to have to go through the process to unfreeze or remove that fraud freeze off of their account. I'd recommend having your employees visit identitytheft.gov, report that to the Federal Trade Commission, and again, they've got the explicit detailed steps. I would request a credit report through annualcreditreport.com, and then ultimately place a credit freeze on at least one of the 3 credit bureaus. You only have to report it on one. I think you can do it online as well. But as soon as you notify one, they will subsequently notify the other 2. And you can put, whether it's a 1-year temporary block, or you can do longer blocks on your credit. And to get the longer freeze, you will need a police case number to keep that in place a little bit longer, I think, to avoid additional charges to put that longer block in place. Certainly contact your respective financial providers, deal with your banks, credit cards, stocks, whatever, and flag them of any irregular transactions. But if you are a known victim of identity theft, you may have your bank put a fraud alert on your local accounts as well. For those that are unfamiliar, you can go to Social Security Administration /my account, and you can look for suspicious activities. So there you can look to see that your earnings actually match what you received from your employer or employers. Something else that the IRS allows you to do is go in and actually set up a PIN. So when you file your taxes electronically, you can put a PIN in place, and it's just it's like a multi-factor authentication piece for that. So you can protect your tax filings and not leave that open-ended where anybody else can go in and just report it on your behalf or not on your behalf. So next, change passwords frequently. I think we're probably all a little bit more on notice now about the integrity of passwords and the security of our privacy and personal accounts. So I'd definitely be making that a more frequent task. And then if you do get engaged with a conversation with any of these organizations, I would just take detailed notes, capture an agent's number, their name, the date and time, and then roughly what you were covering with that. I've actually worked with a couple claimants throughout the pandemic that we get them straightened out, and then their profile gets flagged again. And so having that history of it certainly helps tell that story. So one thing that is new within the state of Kansas, and it's actually a provision from the reforms that we passed this year, is Representative Susan Estes out of Wichita recommended, since the workforce centers and the contact centers were closed during the pandemic, and claimants, legitimate claimants that were struggling to file a claim, they didn't have brick and mortar to go to. And then you get the flag freezes on somebody's account. They can't get through their phone lines. They can't get documents uploaded. There's nuances and shortcomings within the website even still today. So Representative Estes actually said, can we partner with our law enforcement agencies? We have a sheriff's office in every county across the state. So ultimately that was put in. Sheriff's office now get to kind of participate in the pain points of the federal Form I-9. Those were the list of documents that a law enforcement agency can use to verify somebody's identity. So if somebody can't go to Topeka, can't get through the phone lines, they can go down to their local law enforcement agency as long as they're participating. And as of last week, there was 38 law enforcement agencies throughout the state that is participating. And I didn't check this morning. I'm guessing that number has grown. But they will verify, validate this information, and then submit this to KDOL through the back channels, and hopefully verify identities and get the fraud freezes lifted off of legitimate Kansans accounts, so we can get those rightful dollars to them. Next, just some employer guidance from KDOL as it relates to appeals for COVID-19 and fraud-related claims throughout the pandemic. Items 1, 2, and 3 are the various classifications of employers throughout Kansas. You can see contributing employers has right under 72,000 employers across the state. Government-rated employers represent about 2,000 entities, and reimbursing employers constitute about 700 businesses throughout the state. The same rings true for all three classifications, that no employer should be charged for any new COVID-19 related claims or fraudulent claims. And so when we get into kind of the list, and this is one of the more popular questions that I got, is I've requested a list of the claims that were filed against my employer. I'm going on 2 months. I've not heard back yet. My suspicion is I would stop holding your breath, and if you're a contributing employer, look for your notice of benefit charges. That statement will be arriving in late October, early November. If you're a reimbursing employer, you're receiving these in every fourth month, late January, April, July, and October. Any and every notice of benefit charge statement that you receive, I would go through that with a fine-tooth comb. And I would appeal any and all fraudulent claims or COVID-19 related claims, because at the onset of this, there was financial relief provisions that were put in place that employers would not be charged for these. So if you've been diligent throughout the pandemic and you've reported, if you got a notice on somebody and you reported it as fraud and you felt like it went into the Bermuda Triangle and you didn't hear back, there's a high likelihood that some of those claims are going to show up on your notice statement, your charge statement. So go through that, not only verify that the name should be on there, but does the amount look correct too? And if there's names that you don't recognize, and there's going to be a fair amount of those, these are ones that you're going to want to appeal as well. The good news is, because the secondary question is, well, if I've lost my appeal window because too much time has passed, what good is this? And we did build some provisions that any claims that were filed from March 1 of 2020 through December 31 of 22, going into next year, any of those claims, you do not have an appeal window. You do not have a statute of limitations where that expires. So as these claims develop, and if some fall on your notice statement, appeal them as soon as you get that data and you become aware that they're actually hitting your employer's account. So I'm going to stop right here real quick and just see if there's any additional questions that have popped up.
Hey Phil, yes, we do have one question. They have never received a notice of benefit charges. Where should they be looking for those to come from?
That should go to, depending on how your organization is set up, if you're registered with a third-party administrator that manages your claims, your charge statement is likely going to be mailed to that same address. If you're a small employer and there's several that are out there that work with a local accountant, maybe their accountant is on record as the address on file. If you're a large employer, regardless of size, that notice statement may be going to your CFO's office or to a finance office, because it goes, typically the UI stuff comes with a tax bill. So if you're having trouble locating that, I would maybe ask around. The likelihood that it's probably with the finance office is pretty high, or with your third-party administrator. If you hit a roadblock there, you can, I think that's the employee self-service portal. You can go in there, and I think there's an opportunity to maybe engage there. And if not, then under your employer account on KDOL's website, and I have a screenshot of this here shortly, but you can go in there and I think you can verify the address that's on record as well. So worst case scenario, there's an employer help desk that KDOL set up, and that'll be coming up here in a few slides, and there's an 800 number that you can call and find out specifically where that's going. One thing, if there's any reimbursing employers that are on the call today and you're not able to join tomorrow, I do want to say that there was some additional financial impact provisions that were passed in the reforms this year. If you've been carrying charges that you've not received credit for through the years, we actually passed a rear-facing and a forward-facing financial impact provision that any charges that you've been carrying, those are going to be wiped from your statements, hopefully, maybe not in the April, maybe not in the July statement, but I would suspect that maybe by the October quarterly statement that you get, those should naturally disappear based on the provisions under the new law. And then any forward components that if you appeal and you lose, or you lost the original claim, benefits were paid out, you appeal, and then you win that, you're not going to have to carry those credits on your account ongoing until they get recouped by the Kansas Department of Labor. As an employer, you're going to be held harmless from a financial perspective, forward and backward. So if you have questions or concerns as those statements develop, certainly reach out, but those credits should be washing away. Next, employer help desk that I talked about, they actually stood this up December 21st of 2020. And this was designed to aid businesses dealing with UI and other issues. The help desk is not for unemployed claimants. It's only for their former employers. So the 800 number is listed here in bold. Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30 was the last hours that I had seen for this. So they can help you with your filing of quarterly wage reports and unemployment tax returns, paying unemployment taxes, your SUTA tax rate questions or concerns, how to handle fraudulent claims. So if you have a very specific claim question, call the 800 number, and hopefully they can at least put you in touch with the most appropriate person that can get resolution the quickest for you. And then also businesses are able to submit applications for the WorkShare program through the employer help desk as well. So, and again, if unemployed workers happen to call this 800 number, they're likely to end the call pretty quick and just ask them to contact the KDOL contact center, at the 800 number, or through the getkansasbenefits.gov website. So it's not really a shortcut to help with claimant issues, but if you have a fraudulent claim, maybe it's an existing employee of yours, you can certainly call this. So they will handle some claimant issues, but it's not for the general public to utilize. Next, the KDOL website. This is kind of they revamped their website recently, shortly after the legislative session. But the primary contact numbers that are listed, these would be the numbers that I would have your employees or past employees call. The hours of operation are listed. But the report fraudulent activity, this is going to be the quickest link to get to the report fraud piece. That will open up and say, we know we have a problem. KDOL has been adamant in saying that they've not been breached throughout the pandemic. They don't feel like they've had a security breach in any manner. I know myself and a lot of HR colleagues, we've been scrutinized by employees that have been fraud victims, asking if our system is secure or not. I know I've talked to countless colleagues that have brought in cybersecurity experts and went through a number of scenarios. But I think the large portion of the UI fraud is related to the data breaches from years throughout the last decade or so, from the Experian breach, the Yahoo breach. There's a whole list of big sites that had been compromised, and ultimately that's what the RockU21 text file with those 8.4 billion passwords are in. It's just a collection of these, so these bad actors can run through a list of password options to try to infiltrate different systems. So, but once you actually click on report unemployment fraud here or report fraud in the banner up top, it'll open up this. And again, Chrome, Firefox, or Edge, or the browsers. But you can report whether you received a notice for yourself or for your employees, if you received a notice for yourself or if you received a notice for somebody else. So the top one I would say is more employer related, but the forms are very similar. They're just wanting to collect basic demographic information. If it's you reporting what's your social, what's your birthday. I've actually sat with a couple of my employees and went through this early on once this portal was available. I will say, and I failed to mention it earlier, is once the multi-factor authentication solution went into place, KDOL came out publicly and said that they recommend that every Kansan go in and create a profile. Essentially, you take ownership of your social, your username, your password, your PIN number. So even if you're not filing a claim, you can create a profile, and that's essentially going to lock that down so somebody else cannot create a fictitious one using any variation of your personal information. So I know once that was pushed out, I sat down and at the dinner table with every member of my extended family, and we created a profile just to kind of mark those. So KDOL did publish a webinar. It was done prior to February 22nd of this year, but a lot of what I brought out, I published in the earlier slides, but if you wanted to see straight from KDOL, I think this was probably back in December when it was actually pushed out, but these are the links if you wanted to go to YouTube, or you could Google them. Kansas SHRM, we've done a lot throughout the pandemic related in the UI fraud space. There's a number of resources. In fact, I think there's probably an easier collection of some of these resources for whether it's a claimant, an employee, or an employer. But we've got a repeat of some of the information that I hit, but there's some 1099-G resources and more specific components on that. There's some earlier webinars that we did throughout the year. One thing that we're actually adding, and this will be part of the link that I'll send out from this webinar, is we're releasing a new job refusal guidance. We've worked with KDOL and took guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor as well, talking about job refusals. Kansas has always had a job refusal reporting mechanism since I think 2013, but there's just not been a lot of need for it in the past historically, but you can certainly imagine now and some of the frustration that employers are seeing. If you have somebody that refuses a job, my recommendation is follow the bit link there at the bottom. It'll actually open up the job refusal form. And this is the data that you'll need to collect and report to DOL as it pertains to a job refusal. I will say though, that report, the printed report, if you complete it as a PDF, you cannot email it, you cannot upload it currently. They want you to follow a URL on that report. It opens up a secure portal and you re-enter the same data. So we are working with KDOL to see if we can get a mass job refusal or a multiple job refusal report if you have more than one instance. So we're trying to streamline that, make it a little more efficient. But for now, I would just advise that any employer can report any known job refusal and let KDOL investigate it from there. So.
Hey, Phil, on that note, before you move on, can you please address how the job refusal form applies to those who don't show up or ghost on interviews?
Yeah, and what's tough is the initial draft that we had on this dealt with job ghosting as well. So they accepted and didn't show up, which we're still going to be able to capture them. We also had guidance on interview ghosting. So somebody commits to an interview, or but they're not accepting a bona fide job offer. As much frustration as exists in the employer community, KDOL cannot and will not do anything as it relates to interview ghosting. Now, if you offer a job and you have a drug testing that's a conditional offer of employment and they fail the drug screen, you can report that because the job opportunity was there. If they accept the job and then ghost you on day one, or don't show up, or they walk out at lunch, don't come back, I would certainly report all of those. So I would love, and I did throughout the pandemic, I had reported several that people said, y'all show up. And so we schedule interview. We schedule managers' times to interview people, and then people don't show up. So it's a complete level of frustration. We certainly get it, but KDOL isn't going to do anything. So it's really not worth the time investment for employers to report the interview ghosting. So, and what they consider is a valid bona fide offer, which says it must include acknowledgement from a claimant or a job seeker, whether that's to a phone conversation, through an email, through a text. You've made the offer and they're refusing it. So they want some sort of acknowledgement that they did turn down the job. Next, really, I know we're wrapping up. We're right about 12:30 here, but what we're going to hit on tomorrow is kind of the aftermath. So how do we move forward from here? What reform initiatives were put in place? How did the laws change? How are the financial components or the provisions going to impact not just reimbursing employers, but all employers as we move forward for the contributing employers to ensure that we don't have a huge escalation of unemployment tax rates. Without any of these changes, we were looking at some employers having an 800% increase going into 2022. So we're certainly thankful and happy that some reforms were passed, and we'll see if we got it all right or if there's more work to be done with the new session in 22. But what we'll hit on is the modernization effort, the unemployment IT system requirements as we look to build a new system, looking at those employer hold harmless provisions, the My Reemployment Plan, which went into effect June 1 of this month. The work refusal provisions we'll hit on again, but the UI tax rate structure for 2022 and moving forward. There's been significant changes in the shared work program. And then we'll hit some of the other lesser common or lesser known provisions that are going to go into effect as well. So the link for tomorrow's session is posted here as well, and certainly hope you can join us tomorrow. I will say, just kind of setting the stage for getting into the legislative journey and the aftermath, we did request in August, I say we, the Kansas business community requested $300 million out of the Kansas CARES Act dollars to be reallocated to the Kansas UI Trust Fund. There was not a lot of appetite, or there's an overriding initiative to not allow that to happen last year. We provided testimony in the off session in September and November, and then really kicked into high gear at the end of January. And here's what we're going to kind of boil out tomorrow is what transpired through the legislative session to get the bill introduced, and then kind of go through the provisions that prevailed and the impact that that's going to have on employers as well as ultimately claimants as well. So with that, I think I hit the early questions. If you did submit a question and you have you'd like additional detail or conversation about it, certainly feel free to give me a shout. You can call my cell phone listed here or shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to visit with you. One question that wasn't specifically in the slides that we hit is the UI call center phones being outsourced to others, either not in Kansas or the workers remote. And the short answer is yes. Frustratingly, Kansas has partnered with call centers outside of the state of Kansas, although there's probably a number that could have been partnered with in Kansas. So that's certainly presenting a challenge because you've got people that aren't even remotely familiar with Kansas. But the learning curve on anybody coming up to speed as they tackle calls, they're trying to triage these. So these call center agents are trying to handle kind of tier one, and as adjudication and other higher level claims, they'll pass you up to tier two or tier three. I've heard somebody say that they'll ask them how the weather is, and they're not even allowed to answer how the weather is because it doesn't necessarily match Kansas weather. So as frustrating as that is, it is what it is. The good news on the call volume, though, since April, and this number is lower than it was at the peak, but KDOL was receiving about 117,000 unique calls per day in April. And as of last week, they're down to about 28,000 unique calls per day. So we're definitely about 25% of where we were 3 months ago, 2 months ago. Still a long way to go, but if you have any kind of one-off or unique claimant situations or frustration points, I'll just extend the invite that you can feel free to reach out to me. I'll do what I can to help. I've tried to help navigate these as much as I can when I can. I know there's a level of frustration for everybody involved. So I will say one practice that we implemented within the Arnold Group is any claim that we had that came in tied to our account, we actually reached out to that employee if they were a former employee and said, hey, there's been a lot of prevalent fraud concerns. We did receive a claim in your name. Just want to verify that this is accurate. If so, please let us know. If you did not file a claim, here's some resources, etc. So that's proved to be beneficial, more so in recent months as we came out of the back end of 2020 and early 2021. But we still do it just kind of as a standard practice, just because I don't think we're completely out of the woods. I know one of the participants today had indicated that they still have a few suspicions of continued potential fraudulent activity going on. So I don't know when we'll let our guard completely down, but honestly, I think we'll probably keep our measures in place until the new system is up and going. So other questions or comments?
We did receive one. This person has received a few determinations and nothing regarding the benefit changes. In the government site state they don't have any current benefit charges. They're concerned about getting hard hit later in the year when they're unable to dispute. Do you have any guidance on that?
Yeah, the good news, as long as it's a Kansas claim. Now, if you're an employer with multi-state operations, I don't know that other states took this provision, but that was one of the biggest things that we wanted to, and it was more the employer hold harmless is not only the financial charges, but preserving the opportunity to truly appeal. And we knew that the best opportunity for what our known exposure was going to be was off that notice of benefit charge statements that nearly 72,000 employers are not going to receive that until October or November of this year. And so that's where we left an open-ended grace period that if you have a claim that was filed from March of 2020 through the end of 2022 next year, you've not spoiled your opportunity to appeal that. So I would continue to be vigilant in watching your notice of benefit charge statements. If we think that we're out of the woods and we get everything resolved from the 2021 statement that we get in fourth quarter of this year, I'm going to be scrutinizing my next charge statement in 22 just to verify that a few more didn't slip in, or as older claims didn't go somehow show back up on my charge statement when it wasn't there previously. So I've worked with countless individuals. I know Ron, if you're on the call, documentation is king for HR. This comes back to kind of keeping records of what you did, the action you took, who you talked to, what date, and that is critical to say this was reported. It's still extremely frustrating that benefits charges were showing up, but you can at least build your case that you reported it. The only provision is the KDOL secretary can still make a final determination that they say, we don't feel this is fraudulent. So you want to build your case. Number one, if the employee on record, if you have a charge for somebody and they've never worked for you, that's going to be pretty easy to build that case. Now, if you have an existing employee, but maybe it's a different social, so you want to check not only spelling of the names that show up on that charge statement, but the full social that shows up, and really just dive in. I think this may be the most in tune that any employer or every employer has been in with their UI statements as we move forward and navigate out the very back end of the COVID hangover here. So other questions?
The only other question was accessing these slides afterwards, which I did just send the link to our website where you can download these slides. We will also send that out after tomorrow's session concludes, so you can access all of this information if you missed anything or wanted to review it. Otherwise, no other questions.
And I will say, I'll just echo on Tara's comments. The slides that are uploaded now are slightly different from today's presentation as well as tomorrow's. So I suspect that by either the end of tomorrow or Wednesday, the full fresh slide decks will be out. And I know we had a question that doesn't pertain to today, it's more tomorrow, but the part of the UI provisions or the reforms is we put a modernization and improvement council in place. That had to be stood up 30 days after the passage of the law. That first meeting is today at 1 o'clock. It's probably going to be a short meeting, being the kickoff meeting, but hopefully we'll have a little bit more details in tomorrow's slide on that and kind of the time frames and what we're looking at and kind of the substance of what that committee makeup or that council structure is going to be, and what their hopefully the targeted outcomes that will be accomplished from having that in place for the next 3 years. So again, thank you everybody for your time today, and we hope to see you tomorrow.